The king has begun the formal process of stripping Prince Andrew of his titles and has served him notice to leave his Windsor home, Buckingham Palace said. He will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It is understood that the king initiated the move with the support of Prince William, and private factors, including welfare, were key in the decision. Buckingham Palace said Andrew agreed to leave Royal Lodge as his links to paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein continue to cause controversy. Although Andrew denies the accusations made by Epstein survivor Virginia Giuffre, Buckingham Palace considers that there have been serious lapses of judgment, it is understood. Andrew will move to a property on the Sandringham estate, it is understood, and any future accommodation will be privately funded by the king. The move will take effect as soon as practicable, with Andrew set to receive an appropriate private provision from the king. Any other sources of income will be a matter for the former duke. The king's brother has come under increasing pressure following revelations in the posthumous memoir of Andrew's sex accuser, Virginia Giuffre. Calls intensified for Andrew to give up his Royal Lodge home in Windsor Great Park after it emerged he paid a peppercorn rent, a token amount that typically exists only to ensure the lease is valid, for more than 20 years. Andrew had sought to draw a line under years of controversy by giving up his royal title and honours earlier this month, following continued allegations against him in relation to Epstein. But the prince, who strenuously denies the allegations, was instead swamped by criticism focused on the property he has lived in effectively rent-free since 2003. In a statement, Miss Giuffre's family said it was the truth and extraordinary courage of an ordinary American girl which brought down a British prince. It continued, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, our sister, a child when she was sexually assaulted by Andrew, never stopped fighting for accountability for what had happened to her and to countless other survivors like her. Today, she declares a victory. We, her family, along with her survivor sisters, continue Virginia's battle and will not rest until the same accountability applies to all of her abusers and abettors connected to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Announcing the removal of Andrew's title, Buckingham Palace added that the king's thoughts and utmost sympathies have been and will remain with the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. Andrew's ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, will also move out of the Royal Lodge and will sort her own living arrangements. There have been reports that William wanted his uncle's situation resolved quickly and for him to vacate Royal Lodge by bonfire night, 5 November, as the prince is due to move his young family to their forever home at Forest Lodge, near Andrew's home, in the coming days. This all comes a day after Parliament's spending watchdog raised concerns over the value for money of Andrew's living arrangements after he stepped down as a working member of the royal family. The Public Accounts Committee, PAC, wrote to the Treasury and the Crown Estate on Wednesday, asking them to explain the rationale behind the lease on the 30-room mansion by November 28th. Meanwhile, US Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramaniam, who has previously called for Andrew to testify before a congressional committee about his links to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to clear his name, has renewed calls for him to give evidence.
They insisted that Andrew had long been living a life separate from public duties, that he had surrendered many of his formal roles, and that he had cooperated to the extent he could with inquiries. Andrew insists on his innocence and has repeatedly denied the accusations made by Ms. Giuffre. But in an age of instantaneous outrage and relentless media scrutiny, denials were not always enough. The reputational damage, critics said, had become permanent. The palace's decision reflected a calculation that even if legal culpability were never proven, the optics, the serious lapses of judgment cited by officials, had already exacted a toll that rendered continuing royal status untenable. For the king, the decision appears to have been especially personal and painful. A younger brother of some charisma and controversy, Andrew had long been a figure the family had attempted to manage discreetly, encouraged to retire from public duties after a disastrous BBC interview back in 2019, allowed to live quietly at Windsor while the rest of the monarchy reoriented itself toward a slimmer, more modern public face. Yet the external pressures had only intensified. William, the Prince of Wales, was reported to have urged speed, anxious for family tensions and public rows to be resolved quickly. There were rumors that William wanted Royal Lodge vacated by bonfire night, November 5, in order to facilitate his own family's planned move to their forever home at Forest Lodge near Andrew's residence. That suggestion of timetable deepened tensions, underscoring the interlocking personal and institutional considerations, family logistics, property plans, and the need to contain a scandal before it metastasized further. Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's ex-wife, and the Duchess of York, was also affected. Buckingham Palace said she would move out of Royal Lodge and make her own living arrangements. Ferguson's life had always been deeply entwined with Andrew's. Their marriage, divorce, reconciliation, and decades of shared history. And the break with Royal Lodge was thus not only a logistical matter, but a symbolic severance of a domestic chapter. Beyond the palace walls, public opinion was fracturing in ways the monarchy could not ignore. Supporters of the royal family argued that the institution had finally done what the public expected, acted to preserve standards and to signal empathy for survivors. Others said it was a case of too little, too late, a belated attempt at reputational damage control that did not address larger questions about privilege, proximity to power, and the ways in which wealth and status can insulate the rich from accountability. Even within a centuries-old institution steeped in precedent and ceremony, the decision posed practical questions. If Andrew was no longer a working royal, what would his funding look like? Buckingham Palace said any future accommodation would be privately funded by the king and that the former prince would receive an appropriate private provision. The wording was intended to reassure, to show that family bonds still mattered, while drawing a firm line around the limits of institutional support for someone no longer representing the crown. For survivors and campaigners, tangible change mattered more than the fine print. Titles are symbolic, but accountability is real, said one advocate who had worked with abuse survivors for years. This is an important step, but it cannot be the end. We want to see truth told and lessons learned, not just a change of address. The palace's statement that the king's thoughts and utmost sympathies would remain with victims was carefully crafted, yet some read it as insufficiently hard-hitting. For them, the moral authority of the monarchy was now on the line. Could it be a beacon of ethical standards and the rule of law, or would it simply weather each storm while protecting its own? Andrew's life, now demoted from an active public role to something much closer to private existence, would be transformed. He had long been a figure of contradiction, a royal with the bearing and opportunities of privilege, yet one whose personal choices and social circles repeatedly drew controversy. The change to name Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was intended to codify that transition, laying administrative groundwork for a private life at Sandringham rather than ceremonial duties in Windsor. At Sandringham, a different rhythm of life would await, quieter, more provincial, removed from the pomp and publicity of Windsor and London. Yet even there, privacy could not be guaranteed. The shadow of the Epstein scandal, the testimony, the memoir, the congressional entreaties, followed with a persistence befitting an age when reputations can be reshaped overnight. Legal experts said the palace's move mitigated some but not all risks. The revocation of titles and removal from official duties would limit Andrew's ability to represent the crown or to draw upon public resources, but questions about whether other institutions, such as Parliament's oversight bodies or judicial forums, might still pursue further inquiries, meant that the story was unlikely to end with a change of address. Internationally, the episode was watched closely. For foreign governments and diplomats who had once hosted or received the prince, the change carried diplomatic nuance. Royal titles carry cachet and access, and their removal alters the landscape of soft power the monarchy wields. For the American politicians who have demanded answers, the move underscored the transatlantic dimensions of the Epstein scandal and the way in which cross-border criminal exposure can drag even the most sheltered figures into public reckoning. Through it all, two images persisted in the public imagination: the quiet notice served by Buckingham Palace and the image of a vast country estate emptying as boxes were moved into waiting cars.
They were small scenes, almost cinematic, yet they represented a far deeper turning point, not only for one man, but for the institution that had tolerated, managed, and sometimes protected him. In the corridors of the palace, courtiers acknowledged the difficulty of drawing such lines between family and institution. Monarchies, after all, are built on a mixture of duty and personal loyalty. But in a modern constitutional framework, they must also answer to the public they serve. The king's decision to remove a title, to rehouse a brother, and to try to shore up the monarchy's moral standing was the result of that constantly evolving balance. For Virginia Dufresne and other survivors, the day the notice was read out at Royal Lodge marked a milestone. Her family's declaration that today she declares a victory captured the visceral relief of those who had campaigned for recognition, and for some, a sense of justice at last. For Andrew, it marked the end of the public chapter and the beginning of a private one, but one shadowed by unresolved questions, public scrutiny, and the long tail of controversy. The palace said the move would take effect as soon as practicable. Those words, measured and procedural, hid the messy human truths beneath: family pain, political calculation, and the inescapable fact that in the modern age, institutions cannot entirely shelter their members from the consequences of their choices. As boxes were packed and moves arranged, the monarchy faced the same unyielding question it has been forced to confront time and again: how to remain an emblem of continuity and duty while responding to a world that demands accountability, transparency, and empathy. In asking one of its own to step back and to take a new name, the king had made a choice that acknowledged both the need for compassion and the necessity of decisive action. Whether it would be enough to restore public confidence remained to be seen. But for now, life at Royal Lodge was changing. A house that had been the backdrop of decades of private dramas, marriages, separations, friendly gatherings, and whispered scandals would soon belong to someone else, and a man who had once carried a prince's style would take up a quieter, differently defined life as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The country watched, measured the moment against its own expectations, and waited to see whether this removal of a title would be the start of a new era of accountability, or merely the latest chapter in a long and tangled story of privilege, oversight, and the slow, grinding work of justice.